In this presentation, we're going to look at Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance. The first thing we're going to do is create a chart that shows the things that we already know, the things that we think we know, and the things we hope to find out while researching Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance. You can do this on your own paper or in your notebook. How many of you remember what atmosphere is? Atmosphere is anything that you're able to figure out if you know when and where something takes place. Since we know when Langston Hughes was born and what country he was from and raised in, what are you able to predict about the life of Langston Hughes? What was his life like before he became famous? A lot of people would just say his life was rough, and it was. On February 1st, 1902, he was born in Joplin, Missouri, to Carrie Hughes and James Hughes. His parents were separated when he was young, and his entire childhood was spent moving from house to house, relative to relative. In 1924, he began college at Columbia University, a very prestigious college, and he studied engineering, which lets me know he was very good at math and science. But then he started to get involved with writers and other artists, became very creative. He decided to leave school and follow his artistry. After hearing about his young life, what type of adult do you think or do you predict he would become? Langston Hughes is famous for a number of things. He was a poet, an author, a playwright, a columnist, a writer, an intellectual, and a social activist. All of these things made him a legend of the Harlem Renaissance. An intellectual means that he was famous just for being a thinker. He was a great thinker. A columnist means he was writing articles without having to cover stories. He was being paid just for writing articles about his own thoughts and feelings on various situations. A social activist means that he used his talents in order to try to change the world, change the country, change the state of his race in America. Dream Deferred is my absolute favorite poem by Langston Hughes, and that's the one that we're going to look at first. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Langston Hughes has an essential question. He wants to know what happens when people don't chase their dreams. He uses several different forms or several different examples of figurative language to do this. He has a simile that compares what a dream is like when it's left unchased, unfollowed, to what happens to a grape when it sits out, dries out, hardens, and wrinkles up in the sun. He uses another simile to compare what happens when you cut yourself and it turns into a sore and it festers and oozes and pusses. He compares that to a dream that's left unattended. He compares the way you sit a piece of meat out and it starts to rot and it starts to smell to what happens when you leave a dream without tending to it or chasing it or trying to actively follow it. He uses another simile to say what happens when you leave a dessert out and it turns into a hard, sugary item. All of these are similes, which means all of these are figurative language used to describe what happens when you have a dream and it just sits there without you actually going after it. And he ends by saying, does it explode? Meaning, does it just die? Does it go away, never again, for you to be able to follow it? The Negro Speaks of Rivers is Langston Hughes' most famous poem. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. One thing we need to know is who the speaker of the poem is. Langston Hughes is not the speaker of the poem. The Negro is the speaker of the poem. So the voice you hear in the poem represents the voice of the entire Negro race. They're trying to make a statement about their history and letting people know that as long as you can go back in the world, that's how far back you can find Negroes. He says that older than the flow of human blood in human rivers. He's comparing the way you can trace the world back through the rivers that run through it to the way that you can trace the human race all the way back. As long as there has been human blood flowing through human beings, there have been Negroes on this earth. He uses various rivers to make his point. He talks about the Euphrates. He talks about the Nile. Everything he's saying traces the culture and history of the Negro race. He talks about raising the pyramids above it. It lets you know. We're talking about the Egyptians. How do I know it's the Egyptians? Because it's on the Nile River, and they're the people who built the pyramids. The Egyptians were from Egypt, which is in Africa. So once again, we're still tracing the history of the black race. He talks about when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans. Well, if you look at Abe Lincoln's autobiography or biography, he talks a lot about when he made trips down the Mississippi to New Orleans and he had his first encounters with slaves and he got to see what black people or Negroes actually went through, what they were treated like, what type of life that they had. There's repetition in this poem. He repeats, I've known rivers. He repeats, my soul has grown deep like the rivers. He's making a point. The point that he's trying to make is that the soul of the Negro, the culture of the Negro, the history of the Negro has gotten deeper and deeper and deeper with time, just as the rivers running through running through the world. You'll be doing a research paper. It is technically called a literary analysis. You are analyzing a poet, Langston Hughes. In order to do that, you're going to have to read at least 10 poems by Langston Hughes and choose 3 that you will focus on in writing your paper. These are all poems by Langston Hughes that you may want to use while doing your research. You will have to keep all of your research together throughout the project so that when it's time for you to turn in your paper, you have proof that you can flip through, whether it's a binder or a notebook or something you do electronically that shows that you have been researching this person and his work throughout time. You really cannot study Langston Hughes without studying the Harlem Renaissance. He was one of the most famous names from the Harlem Renaissance. In order to know the Harlem Renaissance, you have to understand it was the new Negro movement. It was a movement in America in which Negroes wanted to be viewed differently. They wanted to be seen differently. They wanted to be respected, and they wanted to stand out. Therefore, it was a cultural movement. It occurred around the same time as the Great Depression, which lets you know what life was like in America for everyone at that time. The Great Depression began with the stock market crash. From Harlem to Paris is an implication that what started in Harlem as a cultural movement, as an artistic movement, made it all the way throughout the world to the artistic center of the world, which was Paris. There is no exact date associated with the Harlem Renaissance, but 1919 to the mid-30s is the approximate time period of the Harlem Renaissance. Your assignment is to write a literary analysis paper on Langston Hughes. Everything you need to get started was in this presentation. Now it's your turn. Use what you have here as a beginning and continue to research the life and times of Langston Hughes. Continue to read and analyze the works of Langston Hughes. Once you've accumulated all the knowledge you need, you can begin writing your research paper.